Romanov dynasty did not fall to a bullet from a Bolshevik pistol. It was buried under a mountain of worthless bonds and a torrent of paper rubles that could not buy a single loaf of bread. In February 1917, the streets of Petrograd erupted. But listen carefully to what the crowds were shouting. They weren't chanting, "Down with the Tsar." They were screaming for bread. The capital city of a mighty empire, an empire that had defeated Napoleon, an empire that spanned 11 time zones, could not feed its own people. 3 centuries of Romanov rule collapsed not because of Lenin's ideology, not because of German gold, but because the Russian state went bankrupt. The treasury was empty. The ruble was worthless. And the social contract that binds every society together, the promise that your labor will buy you food, had been ripped to shreds. To understand why a loaf of bread brought down an empire, we have to go back decades to the moment Russia decided to play a game it could not win. The story they taught you in school is a comforting lie. It suggests that history is made by brilliant or mad men, a story of spies, agents, and ideological fervor. Here's the myth you learned: Lenin, exiled in Switzerland, is smuggled by the Germans in a sealed train across Europe. He arrives at Finland Station in April 1917, climbs onto an armored car, and declares that the revolution must be seized. His agitators spread Bolshevik propaganda among the starving workers and mutinous soldiers. In October, the Bolsheviks storm the Winter Palace, and the revolution is won. This narrative is deeply satisfying because it gives us heroes and villains. It places Lenin at the center of history, a man so brilliant, so ruthless, that he single-handedly toppled an empire. But here's what the textbooks don't tell you. When Lenin arrived in Petrograd in April 1917, the revolution had already happened. The Tsar had already abdicated. The monarchy had already fallen. And Lenin himself, the man who supposedly orchestrated the revolution, was so surprised by events that he wrote a letter from Switzerland saying the revolution had caught him by surprise. The Bolsheviks themselves were a minor faction in 1917. They had no plan, no army, no blueprint for seizure. Even the Mensheviks, their Marxist rivals, dismissed the Bolsheviks as irrelevant. They argued that Russia was too backward for socialism, that a bourgeois revolution had to happen first. But while the revolutionaries were debating doctrine in smoky rooms, a far more powerful force was at work, the slow, grinding arithmetic of financial ruin. The hidden hand of the Russian Revolution was not the ghost of Karl Marx, but a French banker in a silk suit. Let's go back to the 1890s. Russia was the world's largest country but an economic backwater, a feudal agrarian society with a few modern factories. Its leaders understood that to remain a great power, it had to industrialize. And so they turned to the only source of capital available, foreign debt. Sergei Witte, the Tsar's Minister of Finance, embarked on the most ambitious industrialization program in modern history. He built the Trans-Siberian Railway. He raised tariffs to protect Russian industry. He invited foreign investment in oil, mining, and steel. But all of this cost money. And Russia didn't have any. So Witte did what every developing nation does: he borrowed. He sold bonds to French investors, offering them the full faith and credit of the Russian Empire. By 1914, Russia had become the world's largest debtor nation, owing its creditors, mostly French banks, more than 9 billion gold rubles. There was a catch, of course. To attract foreign investors, Russia had committed to the gold standard, tying the value of the ruble to a fixed amount of gold. This was the ultimate promise: our currency is as good as gold. For a few glorious years, it worked. Russia industrialized at breakneck speed. The economy grew. The Tsar seemed modern. French bankers collected their interest payments. Everyone was happy. But here's what they didn't tell the French bondholders: every ruble they lent was backed by nothing more than the Tsar's promise. And promises, as we shall see, are fragile things. This system was held together by a single, fragile thread, the promise of the ruble. And when the first shots of World War I were fired, that thread was cut. World War I was not a political crisis that created an economic crisis. It was an economic crisis that disguised itself as a political one. On August 1, 1914, Russia entered the Great War. Within weeks, the Tsarist government realized the horrifying truth. Its revenue was a fraction of what it needed to fund the war. Here are the numbers. The war cost the Russian treasury approximately 3 billion rubles per year. But total state revenue in 1914, taxes, tariffs, everything, was less than 1.5 billion rubles. The state had two options: raise taxes, politically impossible, or borrow more money. The foreign credit markets had frozen. So it chose the third option, the one that always destroys nations. It printed money. The government suspended the gold standard. It simply turned on the printing presses. Between 1914 and 1917, the amount of paper rubles in circulation exploded from 1.6 billion to over 10 billion. At first, no one noticed. But then prices began to rise. A loaf of bread that cost 7 kopecks in 1914 cost 28 kopecks by 1916. By 1917, it cost 70 kopecks. Inflation was running at 400% per year. The soldiers at the front received their pay in paper rubles. They sent it home to their families. By the time it arrived, it could buy half of what it could when they had earned it. Letters from the front are filled with this despair. "We are fighting for the Tsar and the fatherland," wrote one soldier, "but our families are starving because our pay is worthless." The army was still fighting, but the economy at home was already dead. The final blow came from a place the Tsar least expected, the grain fields of his own empire. The Russian peasant was the ultimate rational actor. He understood that a ruble in 1917 was worth less than a kopeck in 1914, so he hoarded the one thing that held value: grain. This is the moment economic historians call the scissors crisis. Imagine two lines on a graph, one representing the price of industrial goods that peasants needed to buy, tools, clothing, kerosene, and another representing the price of grain that peasants sold. The scissors began to open in 1915. Industrial prices skyrocketed faster than grain prices. The peasant realized he was exchanging a bushel of wheat for less and less in return. So he stopped selling. Why trade your grain for paper rubles that are losing value by the day? The peasant hoarded his harvest, fed his livestock, and waited. He was making a rational economic decision. It was the same decision that millions of rational people make today when they hold gold, real estate, or hard assets instead of cash. But when the peasants stopped selling, the cities starved. By February 1917, Petrograd had only enough grain reserves for a few weeks. Citation 2. Women stood in the freezing cold for hours, only to be told the markets were empty. On International Women's Day, thousands of textile workers, mostly women, walked off the job. They marched to the bread lines and then to the factories, shouting, "Bread! Bread! Bread!" This was the February Revolution. Not a planned political uprising, a spontaneous explosion of desperation. The state had broken its side of the social contract. It had printed money until the money was worthless, and then demanded that its citizens accept that worthless paper in exchange for their labor, their goods, and their survival. The peasants refused. The workers starved. And the Tsar found himself trapped. While the city starved, the Tsar found himself trapped. The institutions of his empire, and the very promise of the ruble, were crumbling from within, exposing a vacuum at the heart of the state. The Tsar wasn't overthrown by revolutionaries. He was abandoned by his own generals and ministers who had finally realized the checkbook was empty. On March 2, 1917, Nicholas II sat in his imperial train at Pskov. He had been on his way back to the capital, but his train was stopped by his own generals. They told him the situation in Petrograd was hopeless. The army had mutinied. The government had collapsed. And they could not guarantee his safety if he returned. But the deeper truth was this: the generals had run the numbers. They knew the army could no longer be supplied. They knew the state treasury was empty. They knew that without money, without bullets, without bread, the war effort, and the empire, was finished. Historians focus on the political pressure, the Duma demanding a responsible ministry, the workers on strike, the soldiers defecting. But the real pressure was financial. The general simply told the Tsar, "We cannot fight. We cannot govern. We cannot protect you. It's over. Nicholas abdicated. No revolutionaries stormed his train. No Bolsheviks fired a shot. The most powerful man in Russia simply signed a piece of paper, handed over the crown, and watched his empire dissolve because no one would lend him any more money. This was the vacuum. A state without money, an army without bullets, a capital without bread. And into this vacuum, a determined figure emerged, not to create the revolution, but to inherit it. Lenin didn't cause the Russian Revolution. He was simply the first capitalist to realize the company was going bankrupt and bought the stock for pennies on the ruble. When Lenin arrived in Petrograd in April 1917, the monarchy had already fallen. His genius was not in creating chaos but in recognizing it. He read the economic reality more clearly than anyone else. The other revolutionaries, the Mensheviks, the social revolutionaries, were still debating political theory. They argued that Russia wasn't ready for socialism, that a bourgeois revolution was historically necessary. They were trapped in their textbooks, looking at the political structure when the economic foundation had disappeared. Lenin was different. He looked at the streets. He saw the bread lines. He heard the soldiers mutinying because their pay was worthless. And he realized that any promise of economic relief, no matter how radical, would win. His April theses were a masterpiece of political marketing. Peace, land, and bread. Not a complicated Marxist manifesto, a simple promise to solve the crisis. Peace to stop the war that was bankrupting the state, land to give the peasants the one thing they valued. Bread to feed the starving cities. He didn't have to be a brilliant economist. He just had to promise what the Tsar couldn't deliver. The old system had proven it couldn't manage the deficit. Lenin offered a new one. And he was right. Within 6 months, the Bolsheviks had taken power. But here's the irony that history usually misses. The moment they seized the Winter Palace, they walked straight into the same trap that destroyed the Tsar. Lenin didn't create the crisis. He simply offered a radical alternative to a system that had already proven it couldn't manage a deficit. But the irony is, he was walking into the very trap that killed the Tsar. The Bolsheviks walked into the Winter Palace thinking they had captured power. What they had actually captured was a national debt of 60 billion rubles, a worthless currency, and a population that was already starving. Here's the irony of ironies. The Bolsheviks had promised to solve the economic crisis. But the economy was beyond saving. The printing presses were still running. The ruble was still collapsing. The peasants were still hoarding grain. Within months of seizing power, the Bolsheviks faced the same dilemma as the Tsar. They didn't have any money, and no one would lend it to them. So they did the one thing they had condemned the Tsar for. They printed more money. By 1921, the ruble had lost 99% of its value. A Russian worker needed 500,000 rubles to buy the same loaf of bread that cost 7 kopecks in 1914. And then came the brutal response. With the currency worthless and the city starving, the Bolsheviks used force. They sent armed detachments into the countryside to seize grain, policy known as war communism. It was the same coerced extraction that the Tsar couldn't enforce, but now with revolutionary ideology justifying it. The result was a catastrophe. Millions of peasants resisted. The civil war erupted. The economy collapsed further. And when the Ukrainian grain harvest failed in 1921, famine killed an estimated 5 million people, a direct consequence of economic mismanagement. The Bolsheviks didn't conquer the economy conquered them. And they resorted to methods far more brutal than anything the Tsar had ever attempted. The revolutionaries discovered that you cannot print your way out of a collapse, no matter how fervent your belief. And that is a lesson the modern world has conveniently forgotten. If you understood that the Bolsheviks failed because they couldn't fix the economy, drop a #ruble in the comments. The same mathematics that destroyed the Tsar are being played out on a global scale in your portfolio, your savings account, and your paycheck. Consider what's happening today. Global debt is at record levels, over $300 trillion. Governments have suspended the traditional constraints on money printing. Central banks are creating money at unprecedented rates. Inflation is eroding the purchasing power of currencies. In 1917, the Russian ruble collapsed because the government couldn't fund its spending through taxes or borrowing. The same story is unfolding now, but on a scale the Tsar could never have imagined. Look at what's happening to your own money. The prices of food, housing, energy, the basic necessities of life, are rising faster than wages. The purchasing power of your savings is shrinking. The social contract that the Tsar broke, the promise that your labor and savings will maintain their value, is being tested again. The difference is that we don't have bread lines in the streets. Yet. The warning of 1917 is this: when a state loses control of its currency, it loses the consent of its people. The Tsar discovered that you can have all the armies in the world, but if you can't feed them, they will mutiny. You can have all the police forces in the world, but if you can't feed the cities, they will revolt. The 1917 revolution wasn't an event in a history book. It was a warning. And if we don't learn the economic lesson, we are destined to repeat the political tragedy. The ultimate lesson of 1917 is this: power is not derived from the barrels of guns, but from the promise of a loaf of bread. No system, monarchy, democracy, or dictatorship, can survive a collapse in the value of its money. The fundamental relationship between the state and the citizen rests on a simple promise: give us your labor and your savings, and we will protect their value. When the state breaks that promise, the people break their consent. The Russian Revolution was not Lenin's triumph. It was a financial bankruptcy that destroyed an empire and killed millions. The revolutionaries didn't cause the collapse, they merely inherited it. And in inheriting it, they inherited the same fate. Today, we watch the same patterns unfold on a global stage. The same assumptions about money, the same confidence in the power of printing, the same belief that we can somehow avoid the arithmetic of debt. We are repeating the mistakes of 1917, just with better technology and larger numbers. If you are ready to stop being a passive observer of history and start understanding the forces that move it, it's time to join us. Don't let the mainstream narrative fool you. Subscribe to join a community that understands how the world really works. If you understand that financial gravity is the only force that truly dictates politics, you are already ahead of 99% of the world. But we need to know, do you see the parallels with today? Are we watching the same tragic comedy play out in slow motion? We need to know if you saw it coming. Here's the question that could change your perspective forever. How many of you think this financial failure is repeating itself in 2026? Drop a yes if you felt the pinch of inflation in your own grocery bills. Drop a no if you think we've learned the lessons of 1917. And if you want to go deeper, if you want to understand exactly how money works, why empires fall, and how to protect yourself when the next crisis hits, subscribe to this channel. The system is fragile. The story is hidden. But you're in on the secret now.